If you've been feeling a weird amount of tension, burnout, or just a general disconnect at work lately, trust me, you are absolutely not alone. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diagnosing the crisis of modern leadership and unpacking exactly what is breaking down behind the scenes.
Get a load of this number. Right now, only 20% of employees worldwide are actually engaged at work. 20%. According to Gallup data, the vast majority of the global workforce is either actively disengaged or, just coasting. We're not talking about a minor dip in morale here. This signals a massive structural failure. It tells us that our current leadership models, they're simply not working for the people operating within them.
And it gets more complicated when you look at the divide, what's often called the leader's burden. Leaders are actually thriving at a rate of 43%, mostly because they have higher status and agency, but they're absolutely drowning in the daily stress of trying to manage disengaged teams. Meanwhile, individual contributors are lagging behind at a 32% thriving rate. So you've got managers stressed from the top down and employees completely disconnected from the bottom up. To systematically treat this crisis, here's our agenda for today. First, a framework overview defining the modern bad leader. Then we'll break down 4 fatal flaws: conflict aversion, the hybrid dilemma, ethical blind spots, and productivity paranoia. Finally, we'll wrap things up with some strategic takeaways.
All right, Section 1, Framework Overview. What exactly defines a bad leader today? We usually picture bad leaders as these intentionally toxic villains, right? But the data tells a completely different story. It's actually less about malicious intent and way more about failing to adapt to our highly digital, post-pandemic era.
So the crucial point here is that we have to shift the blame away from individual workers. The true villains causing all this friction are systemic, organizational phenomena. We need to look at the psychological blind spots created by high-pressure environments, because when managers aren't trained to lead in a flexible environment, fear and paranoia just totally take over.
Which brings us to Section 2, Flaw number 1, Conflict Aversion and Shifting Accountability. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? We usually think of bad bosses as overly aggressive. But honestly, constantly avoiding conflict is actually just as destructive to a team's culture. Because avoiding those hard conversations allows friction to fester, and it is costing U.S. businesses a staggering $359 billion annually. Think about that for a second. Employees are spending nearly 3 hours every single week just navigating unresolved interpersonal friction. When leaders try to just smooth things over instead of addressing the root cause, they aren't keeping the peace. They're just deferring a massive cost.
So, how do we fix this? Leaders absolutely must transition from defending their intent to actively understanding their impact. Instead of immediately jumping to a defensive, well, what I meant was, a conflict-intelligent leader gets curious. They ask, how did that land? It's a subtle shift, but it changes the entire dynamic of the conversation from combat to collaboration.
Let's transition to Section 3. Flaw number 2, Lack of Flexibility and the Hybrid Work Dilemma. This centers around the ongoing battle over where work actually gets done. It's become the defining workplace debate of our era, and mishandling it is a super fast track to terrible leadership. Look, hybrid is definitively the dominant model right now, making up 67% of the modern workplace. Yet, we are seeing executive mandates increasingly restricting this flexibility. Executives are pushing for more office days, usually citing culture and control, while employees are flat out refusing to give up the flexibility that the data proves makes them highly productive. We call this the flexibility paradox. The organization needs coordination, but the employee needs autonomy. Literally, everyone wants flexibility, but nobody agrees on the terms. Companies that try to force rigid, top-down mandates are losing their absolute best talent, simply because they treat hybrid work as a compromise to be tolerated rather than a completely new system to be thoughtfully designed. Moving right along to Section 4, Flaw number 3, Corporate Blind Spots and Unethical Conduct. Here, we look at how relentless pressure for financial performance can completely erode moral decision-making. And we aren't talking about blatant corporate fraud here. It's about the quiet, everyday compromises that go totally unnoticed. When a corporate culture prioritizes loyalty and hitting targets over pure transparency, well-meaning professionals develop ethical blind spots. Just imagine a managerial accountant who slightly adjusts some numbers to avoid upsetting their boss in a monthly meeting. They think they're just being a team player, right? But they are completely blind to the fact that they are fundamentally compromising their professional integrity. This academic framework is known as the normalization of deviance. It rarely starts with a massive, headline-grabbing scandal. Instead, it's the slow, normalized acceptance of minor shortcuts. When minor deviations go unpunished, they just become the way we do things around here. And over time, the formal rules are completely forgotten in favor of these informal, unethical shortcuts. Our fifth section brings us to flaw number 4, poor communication and micromanagement. Let's examine the digital surveillance culture that has really poisoned global teams. Because when leaders can't physically see their employees sitting at a desk, a very specific type of anxiety sets in. Get this, an incredible 85% of leaders admit they lack confidence that their hybrid employees are actually being productive. That is a massive trust deficit. Despite all the data showing that hybrid workers are incredibly effective, managers are plagued by productivity paranoia. And that paranoia leads them to implement invasive digital tracking tools just to try and regain some sense of control. And what happens? This intense micromanagement forces employees into what we call productivity theater, where they waste up to 10 hours a week just faking visible work to soothe their boss's anxiety. We're talking about utterly pointless tasks here. Loudly discussing workloads, buying mouse jigglers just to keep the status icon green, or attending meetings that desperately wanted to be an email. It completely destroys actual productivity. Finally, Section 6, Key Takeaways for Global Leaders and HR Managers. Now that we've diagnosed the symptoms across conflict, hybrid setups, ethics, and trust, what's the prescribed treatment? How do we actually build a modern, high-functioning team? Well, to rebuild trust, managers must completely abandon attendance-based tracking and evaluate teams strictly on objective outputs. First step, transition to a results-only work environment or ROE. That means dismantling those toxic surveillance tools. Second, rely on clear objectives and key results. And third, throw out that outdated annual review in favor of highly supportive weekly check-ins. Furthermore, you've got to establish structured, predictable schedules to protect your team from focus fragmentation and coordination fatigue. Think of this as the ultimate workplace hack. If you anchor Tuesday through Thursday for in-person collaboration and mentoring, and fiercely protect Mondays and Fridays for remote deep work, you get the absolute best of both worlds. Everyone coordinates seamlessly, and autonomy is preserved. I'm going to leave you to reflect on this question regarding your own workplace. Are your corporate policies actively building organizational trust, or are they quietly breeding productivity paranoia? Because every rule, every software tool, and every check-in tips the scales one way or the other. Hopefully, this explainer has given you the strategic insight needed to start tipping those scales toward trust today. Thanks for hanging out with us, and I'll catch you next time.